In the absence of the state, the people will crown their own king. And in Tivoli Gardens, there was only one throne. The year was 1969. Kingston, Jamaica, an island paradise for tourists, a war zone for those born in the wrong neighborhood. In the heart of West Kingston, in the labyrinth of zinc fences and crumbling concrete known as Tivoli Gardens, a boy named Christopher Michael Koch entered a world already soaked in blood and politics. His father was Lester Lloyd Koch, better known on the streets as Jim Brown, a name that commanded fear and respect in equal measure. Jim Brown wasn't just a gangster. He was a founder of the Shower Posse, a criminal organization so named because they showered their enemies with bullets. Christopher grew up watching his father build an empire not through legitimate business, but through powder, violence, and political manipulation. The Shower Posse controlled the flow of powder and crystal from Jamaica to American cities, New York, Miami, Philadelphia, and beyond. They were ruthless, efficient, and connected to the Jamaica Labor Party, which used them as muscle during elections. In Jamaica, politics and crime weren't separate. They were married, and the wedding had been paid for in blood. Young Christopher, known to everyone as Dudus, learned early that in Tivoli Gardens, the government didn't provide security, employment, or justice. His father did. When people needed food, Jim Brown provided. When they needed protection, Jim Brown sent his soldiers. When they needed someone to fear, Jim Brown made sure they remembered who was in charge. And Christopher watched it all with quiet, calculating eyes. But in 1992, tragedy struck. Jim Brown was arrested and held in a Kingston jail, awaiting extradition to the United States on drug and murder charges. Before American authorities could take him, a fire mysteriously broke out in his cell. Lester Lloyd Koch burned to death under suspicious circumstances. Some said it was a state-sponsored execution. Others whispered it was a message from rivals. Either way, Jim Brown was gone, and the throne of Tivoli Gardens stood empty. Christopher Koch was only 23 years old, but in the ghetto, age didn't matter. Only power did, and Dudus had been trained for this moment his entire life. When Christopher Koch inherited his father's network, he didn't simply continue the business. He transformed it. Where Jim Brown had been a warrior, Dudus became a strategist. Where his father ruled through fear alone, Dudus understood something deeper. True power comes not just from making people afraid, but from making them dependent. He reorganized the Shower Posse, streamlining operations and expanding their reach across the Caribbean and into North America. Tons of powder and crystal flowed through Jamaica to American streets every month. The profits were staggering, millions of dollars that Dudus funneled back into Tivoli Gardens. But unlike typical gangsters who hoarded wealth, Dudus played a different game. He became a shadow government. In Tivoli Gardens, if you needed a job, you went to Dudus. If you needed school fees for your children, you went to Dudus. If someone wronged you and the police did nothing, you went to Dudus. And justice, brutal and swift, was delivered. He paid for funerals, funded back-to-school programs, organized community events, and made sure that no one in his territory went hungry. The Jamaican government had abandoned West Kingston decades ago, but Dudus never did. The people of Tivoli Gardens didn't call him a drug lord. They called him president. Not sarcastically, but with genuine reverence. In their eyes, Christopher Koch was more legitimate than any politician in Kingston's parliament. He didn't make empty promises during election season. He delivered every single day. And in return, the community became his fortress, his army, and his shield. By the early 2000s, Dudus had built something unprecedented, a criminal organization that functioned as a welfare state. He controlled the flow of stuff moving through Jamaica with mechanical efficiency. But he also controlled something far more valuable, the loyalty of thousands of people who would die for him without question. Dudus ran Tivoli Gardens like a corporation mixed with a dictatorship. He had enforcers, accountants, distributors, and soldiers, each with specific roles and responsibilities. His network extended far beyond Kingston. The Shower Posse had cells in major American cities, moving powder, crystal, dope, and pot through sophisticated smuggling routes. They used fishing boats, commercial cargo, human mules, and corrupt officials to bypass authorities. But what made Dudus truly dangerous wasn't just his criminal enterprise. It was his political protection. The Jamaica Labour Party, particularly through their strongholds in West Kingston, had a symbiotic relationship with the Shower Posse. During election seasons, Dudus's soldiers ensured that rival party supporters stayed away from polling stations in Tivoli Gardens. In return, politicians turned a blind eye to his operations, and sometimes even actively protected him. Inside Tivoli Gardens, Dudus established a parallel justice system. If someone stole from a neighbor, they were brought before Dudus. If someone disrespected a woman, they answered to Dudus. If someone was suspected of being an informant, they disappeared. His word was law, and his judgments were final. There were no appeals, no second chances for traitors. Bodies turned up in gullies and abandoned lots as warnings, silent reminders that the president's authority was absolute. Yet he wasn't a monster in the eyes of his people. He was stern but fair, ruthless but generous. Old women who lived in Tivoli Gardens spoke of him with maternal affection, calling him a good youth who took care of the community. Children knew him as the man who gave them Christmas presents and school supplies. Young men saw him as a provider of employment in a country where unemployment in the ghetto exceeded 50%. This was Dudus's genius. He understood that power built on fear alone is fragile, but power built on dependency is nearly unbreakable. The people of Tivoli Gardens didn't just obey him, they loved him. And they would defend him against anyone, including the government itself. While Dudus played president in Kingston, American law enforcement agencies were building a case against him. The DEA, FBI, and ATF had been tracking the Shower Posse for years, connecting murders in New York and Philadelphia back to orders given from Tivoli Gardens. By 2009, U.S. authorities had enough evidence to indict Christopher Coke on charges of drug trafficking and gun running. They wanted him extradited to face trial in New York. But here's where things got complicated. Dudus wasn't just a criminal. He was a political asset. The Jamaica Labour Party, led by Prime Minister Bruce Golding, was reluctant to hand him over. For months, the Jamaican government stalled, citing concerns about how evidence had been gathered. Behind closed doors, everyone knew the real reason. Dudus had too many connections, too much leverage, and most importantly, too many voters under his control. The standoff between the United States and Jamaica dragged on for nearly a year. American diplomats pressured, threatened, and warned that Jamaica's relationship with the U.S. was at stake. The Jamaican government squirmed, caught between international pressure and domestic political calculations. And in Tivoli Gardens, Dudus prepared for war. He knew the Americans wouldn't stop. He knew the Jamaican government would eventually buckle under pressure. And he knew that when they came for him, they would come with everything they had. So Dudus did what any president facing invasion would do. He armed his citizens and fortified his territory. In May 2010, the Jamaican government finally issued an arrest warrant for Christopher Coke. But by then, Tivoli Gardens had transformed into a fortress. Barricades went up at every entrance. Armed men, some barely out of their teens, took positions on rooftops and street corners. The community, which had benefited from Dudus's generosity for years, mobilized to protect their president. On May 23, 2010, Jamaican security forces, backed by military units, launched an assault on Tivoli Gardens. What followed was unlike anything Jamaica had seen since the political violence of the 1980s. Gunfire echoed through narrow streets, smoke filled the air, and the entire neighborhood became a battlefield. Dudus's soldiers, armed with automatic weapons smuggled from the same American cities where they sold stuff, fought back with shocking ferocity. The siege lasted for 5 days. Security forces went house to house, engaging in close quarters combat with defenders who knew every alley, every rooftop, every hiding spot. Helicopters circled overhead, armored vehicles pushed through barricades, and the Jamaican government imposed a state of emergency. International media descended on Kingston, broadcasting images of what looked like a military invasion of an urban neighborhood. When the smoke finally cleared, the official death toll was 73 civilians, though many residents claimed the real number was far higher. Entire sections of Tivoli Gardens lay in ruins. Buildings were riddled with bullet holes, homes were destroyed, and the streets were stained with blood. But despite the overwhelming force deployed by the government, Christopher Coke was not found. He had vanished. For weeks, Christopher Coke evaded capture, moving through Jamaica like a phantom. Despite being the most wanted man in the country, he managed to slip through security checkpoints and avoid detection. Rumors spread wildly. Some said he had fled to Haiti, others claimed he was hiding in the mountains, a few insisted he was still in Kingston, protected by loyalists. The truth was both simpler and stranger. Dudus was trying to negotiate. He wanted assurances, guarantees, a way to surrender without being immediately extradited to the United States, where he faced life in prison. He reached out through intermediaries, through lawyers, through church officials. But the Jamaican government, now under intense scrutiny for the Tivoli Gardens massacre, had no room to negotiate. On June 22, 2010, police stopped a vehicle at a checkpoint outside Kingston. Inside was a man wearing a woman's wig and glasses, trying to disguise himself. Within minutes, they realized who he was. Christopher Coke, the president of Tivoli Gardens, the man who had commanded an army and controlled a kingdom, was arrested without a shot being fired. His capture was almost anticlimactic. No dramatic standoff, no final battle, just a quiet surrender on a dusty roadside. Within days, he was on a plane to New York. The Jamaican government, eager to repair its relationship with the United States, expedited the extradition process. And just like that, the president was removed from his kingdom and thrown into the American justice system. In a federal courtroom in Manhattan, Christopher Coke faced a sprawling indictment that detailed decades of criminal activity. Prosecutors painted a picture of a ruthless drug lord who had ordered murders, shipped tons of powder and crystal into American cities, and corrupted an entire nation's political system. Witnesses testified about executions, torture, and a reign of terror that stretched from Kingston to Brooklyn. But what struck observers most wasn't the brutality described in court. It was Dudus himself. He sat quietly, almost meekly, in his prison jumpsuit. Gone was the aura of power, the commanding presence that had made him a legend in Jamaica. In the courtroom, he looked like what he physically was, a short, middle-aged man with tired eyes. The president had been reduced to just another defendant. His lawyers tried to negotiate, but the evidence was overwhelming. Cooperating witnesses, wiretaps, financial records. The American government had built an airtight case. In 2011, facing the prospect of life in prison without parole, Christopher Coke made a decision. He would plead guilty. The plea deal was straightforward. Coke would admit to racketeering conspiracy and conspiracy to commit assault in aid of racketeering. In exchange, some charges would be dropped and he would receive a defined sentence rather than life imprisonment. On August 31, 2011, he stood before Judge Robert Patterson and formally entered his guilty plea. When asked if he understood the charges, Dudus responded quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." When asked if he was pleading guilty because he was in fact guilty, he paused, then answered, "Yes, Your Honor." The president had surrendered not just his freedom, but his narrative. No grand statements, no political speeches, no defiance. Just a simple acknowledgement of guilt in a language far removed from the streets of Tivoli Gardens. On June 8, 2012, Judge Patterson sentenced Christopher Coke to 23 years in federal prison. The man who had ruled a kingdom, who had been called president by thousands, would spend the next 2 decades in an American prison cell. He is currently incarcerated in a facility far from Jamaica, far from the streets where his name once commanded absolute authority. When Dudus was taken away, Tivoli Gardens didn't transform overnight into a peaceful community. The power vacuum he left behind created chaos. Rival factions fought for control, violence spiked, and the area descended into instability. The social programs he had funded collapsed without his financial backing. The parallel government he had built crumbled without his leadership. But something else happened too. People began to speak more openly about the cost of his rule. Stories emerged about young men who had been executed on suspicion of disloyalty, about the fear that accompanied the generosity, about the impossibility of leaving the organization once you were in. The love many felt for Dudus was real, but so was the terror that enforced that love. The Jamaican government tried to fill the void with development programs and increased police presence, but decades of neglect couldn't be fixed overnight. Tivoli Gardens remains one of Kingston's most challenging neighborhoods, a place where poverty, violence, and political manipulation continue to define daily life. Meanwhile, the Shower Posse still exists, though fragmented and weakened. Other organizations have risen to compete for control of Jamaica's drug trade, and the flow of stuff to America continues through new routes and new operators. Christopher Coke's arrest didn't end the drug trade. It simply removed one player from a game that never stops. In Jamaica, Christopher Coke remains a controversial figure. To some, he is a folk hero, a man who provided for his community when the government failed, who stood up to foreign interference, who represented strength in the face of abandonment. Songs celebrate him, murals honor him, and his name is spoken with a mixture of reverence and sadness. To others, he is a cautionary tale, a criminal who exploited poverty to build a drug empire, who murdered without hesitation, who corrupted Jamaica's political system and brought violence to communities across the Caribbean and North America. They point to the bodies, the shattered families, the young men who died fighting for him during the siege. Both perspectives contain truth. Christopher Coke was neither purely a monster nor purely a hero. He was a product of a failed state, a man who filled a vacuum created by governmental neglect and political corruption. He understood that in places the state abandons, someone will always rise to take control, and he made sure that someone was him. His story raises uncomfortable questions about power, legitimacy, and the social contract. When a government fails to provide security, justice, and opportunity, can we blame communities for turning to those who do, even if those providers are criminals? When a man feeds the hungry and protects the vulnerable, does it matter that his money comes from stuff and violence? When thousands of people call someone president, does that title become in some perverse way legitimate? These are questions Jamaica still wrestles with, questions that extend far beyond one neighborhood in Kingston. Because Tivoli Gardens isn't unique. Similar stories play out in Rio de Janeiro's favelas, Johannesburg's townships, Chicago's South Side, and countless other places where the state is absent or hostile, and power flows to whoever can claim it. Today, Christopher Coke sits in an American federal prison, serving a sentence that won't end until he is in his 60s. He is cut off from the kingdom he built, from the streets where his word was law, from the people who called him president. In the brutal arithmetic of the American prison system, he is just another inmate, another number, another forgotten man. He receives few visitors. His appeals have been denied. The powder and crystal that once made him one of the most powerful men in the Caribbean are distant memories, replaced by prison food and concrete walls. The man who once commanded armies now commands nothing. But in Tivoli Gardens, his memory endures. Old women still speak his name with affection. Young men who were children during his reign have heard the stories and built him into mythology. The president may be gone, but the presidency itself, the idea that someone from the ghetto could rise to power and take care of their own, remains. That idea is Christopher Coke's most dangerous legacy. Not the stuff he moved, not the violence he ordered, not the money he made, but the blueprint he left behind. He proved that in the absence of the state, a criminal organization can become the state. He demonstrated that power doesn't require legitimacy from governments, only from the people you control. And somewhere in Jamaica, or in Colombia, or in Mexico, or in any of the countless places where poverty and neglect create vacuums, someone is studying that blueprint. They're watching, learning, calculating. They see what Dudus built, and they're thinking, I could do that. I could be president too. Because that's the thing about thrones. When one king falls, there's always someone waiting to take their place. Some men are born into power. Some fight for it. But a few build it from nothing, in places everyone else forgot. Christopher Coke didn't need a government to crown him. The people did. And in Tivoli Gardens, for a moment in time, he was more than a criminal. He was a president who never wore a crown but carried a kingdom on his shoulders, until the weight of it crushed him, and the throne he built turned into a cage.